Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our second installment on the book of Exodus. And so I thought what I will do today is talk about the plagues. There's 10 plagues in Egypt and talk about the reason that God brought all of this about. So let's remind ourselves in Exodus, the family of Jacob is 70 people at the beginning, or I should say at the end of Genesis. In the account that you'll be reading, they have multiplied over a period of 430 years to 2 million people, at least 2 million people. And through those 430 years, they were enslaved. And they have been crying out to God that whole entire time, God, please deliver us. And so God brings about the Exodus, the mass exiting and rescuing of the nation of Egypt. But he does that for a couple of reasons. And so one was to deliver the people out of bondage. That was one of his motivations for doing that. Another motivation would be so that them and the world, the whole entire world watching, looking on, would recognize that God is the one true God, not just the God of a local area or region, but the God of the whole entire world. And here's another one. Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. This statement is at the very end, at the beginning of the last plague, but applies for all of it. There's a reason that God did what he did. And in chapter 12, verse 12, he says, and against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. God is judging the gods or goddesses, the so-called gods or goddesses that they worshipped. And he's also bringing in judgment the Egyptians that worshipped those particular gods. And this was meant to be done in a powerful display of action. And this was done for even future generations to remember what God has done. So all throughout the rest of the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, they'll refer back to this Exodus event as a major event where God rescued his people and God was gracious. Okay, so the Egyptians were one of the most polytheistic religions of the ancient world. They have around 80 gods or goddesses. So not as much as the unnumbered amount that the Hindus have, but nonetheless, 80 gods or goddesses that they worshipped. And the people believe, or scholars believe, that the plagues took around 10 months, and that the exact plague might be happening at the exact time in which that particular god or goddesses were in charge of protection, because these gods were in charge of all different things that pertain to your life on a day-to-day basis. The rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, the Nile bringing water, the water overflowing. So every little detail of life had something to do or had a connection to some god or goddess. And what God is going to do is he's going to use these 10 plagues to show the people, to show the Egyptians, the things that you worship aren't real at all, and they're false. And he's going to show the Jewish people who had been praying for 430 years, God, can you deliver us? He's going to show them just how powerful he is. So here's a little chart. Going over the 10 plagues. And so you can kind of see there's 3 groupings, and then there's one final plague. In group number 1, we can see that they follow a pattern. There's a warning in the morning. There's a pronouncement like, hey, if you don't do this, this is going to happen. And then there's a plague that happens that Pharaoh, or I should say Moses or Aaron, doesn't pre-warn the people about. And this goes 3 times. Aaron's staff is used. The rod is not mentioned. And here Moses is actually using Aaron's staff. And so you see this, and you can see that it's growing from merely detestable. It's an annoyance, these things. It's kind of annoying to go through. Here, it's pain and some loss with the Egyptians. And here it's drastic upheaval of nature. And so they go from from small to greater. And we see they follow this pattern. And the last one is the death of the firstborn, which has been really, really sad. And you can see here that these gods labeled with in bold, that's the gods that are being attacked. One of possibly many gods that they were worshiping at that time, and each god was in charge of something. Anyway, so let's go over this just a little bit. Pharaoh was considered to be God on earth. He was a divine son of Ra. He was the mouthpiece for God. And so you can kind of see Pharaoh and Moses are clashing together. The mouthpiece of Ra versus the mouthpiece, the prophet, the spokesperson for Yahweh in Moses. So the plagues covered around 10 months. And so we have to remember that when we're reading it, that lots of time period is passing between these plagues. Okay, so the turning the Nile into blood. It attacks a couple different gods that were the protectors of the Nile. And some people believe that Pharaoh was actually going to the Nile to do a ceremony, which he did on a regular basis, because one of the things with these gods and goddesses and temples, it's very much ritual. You have to do this over and over again. And so some believe that he was going to the Nile when Moses and Aaron showed up and warned him, and then turned the water into blood for 7 days. The plague lasted 7 days. The Nile was worshipped as a god, and the Egyptians were dependent upon the fertility of that water. It flooded over once a year, and the flooding was a sign that the god was pleased with what they were doing. And so when God attacks and puts judgment upon this area in the first plague, he's attacking no less than 9 of their so-called gods or goddesses with that one act of this kind of nuisance of a 7-day plague. Okay. So as I mentioned, it goes from kind of annoyance to nuisance to it just keeps getting more and more. Plague number 2 is frogs. Oddly enough, they worshipped they had a god who was embodied, or they were seen as the embodiment of a particular god. And so it would be a capital offense for you to kill a frog. So no frog legs for dinner. So think about this. The plague happened in such a way where the frogs filled the land, where you couldn't walk around your house without squishing a god between your toes. That would really change the way you think about that god, wouldn't it? If you grew up as an Egyptian to say, oh, we consider this god or this animal to be sacred because it reminds of this god. We consider this beetle to be sacred. All those types of things. And now God is causing massive upheavals in the land in such a way where everybody's having to rethink, wait a minute, I thought we had a God that's strong enough to protect us from this. And through a period of 10 months, the Egyptians should have concluded, yeah, the gods that we've been serving are not powerful at all. And as a result, actually, in the Exodus, some Egyptians actually do leave with the Jewish people in recognition of the God Yahweh is way powerful, more powerful than the gods of Egypt. Okay, so plague number 3, gnats. So, as I mentioned, there's ceremony always involved with the priests of these gods and goddesses. Well, that means they had a whole grouping of people, the priests, that was their job to go and make sure they did this over and over again to make sure that this god or this goddess is pleased. Well, when they are covered with gnats and they start to be affected by that, all their ceremonies had to change and they had to stop. And so all the welfare of that land had to come to a halt, because now the priests, because of this other plague, the third plague, they're no longer able to do the things that they were normally doing on a daily basis to perform at these temples and at these ceremonies. Okay, so from gnats to swarms of insects. And you can kind of see a progression of this. If there's frogs in the land and the frogs are eventually dying out, there's going to be a swarm of insects to those frogs. And so this is the first time that Pharaoh says, okay, it's getting a bit hot here. How about you guys go and leave for a little bit to worship your God and then come back and be my slaves? And he said, no, thank you. That's not going to happen. So insects are coming. And as the result of the insects, they probably carried with them some disease. And so plague number 5 is the death of livestock. They had sacred bulls that were kept, cared for like a king in those days. And so when God is attacking their system, he's attacking that idea that what you're actually worshiping is not a God at all. It's just an animal. And you should abandon that. So a lot of the livestock was killed. Not all the livestock was killed. Remember, Pharaoh still had horses at the end when he goes and chases the Israelites. He still has horses. So not all the livestock were killed, but quite a few were. So now boils go into the land. Now, I should also mention that some of these plagues affected everybody. I think the first 3 plagues affected everybody in Egypt. And then as the plagues progress, we find that the Israelites were actually exempt. It wasn't happening to them. It was happening to the Egyptians. And this is an example here where boils started to appear all over the skins of the Egyptians. And as I mentioned before, with their rituals of having to go to worship, well, they couldn't do that because they were unclean. They actually couldn't go before the Pharaoh because that was considered to have this disease on you was considered to be unclean. And so they couldn't even go to Pharaoh. They couldn't even go to any temple to worship. They're kind of in quarantine, as we're familiar with. So now the next plague, plague number 7, hail, would be attacking all the stuff that's around them. And so that would, as an agricultural society, that would really hurt them. This plague would have devastated most of all their crops. And if their cattle had just been affected by the death of the cattle, the next plague would have affected their crops. The only thing they could have hoped for was a good harvest, and their next harvest would have been wheat. And guess what the next plague is? Locusts, to come and eat all that wheat. All the harvest that actually remained after the death of the livestock and the hail, the next season of harvest was attacked by locusts. And so it would have taken 130 million locusts per square miles to accomplish this plague. The locust plague was an awesome pestilence and one of the most feared pestilence of the ancient world. They could eat their weight in one day, and they were so numerous that the sky was covered black. Just imagine that, a swarm of locusts coming in and eating all your crops in just one day. That's pretty crazy. Plague number 9, they're getting worse. They're getting worse. They're getting worse. Amun-Ra, their god, and Pharaoh being the spokesperson or the son of that god, was the sun god, said to be the most powerful. And now in one fell swoop, God, Yahweh, is turning the light off, and it's darkness in the land. It's interesting, you can also see this darkness fell on the land, I think at noontime, when Jesus Christ passed away 2,000 years ago in Israel. It became dark. So Ra and Pharaoh were hit hard with this and shown in front of everybody that there's no power there whatsoever, that Yahweh is stronger. So let's see. Okay, so our last plague would attack at least 6 different deities that were in charge of protecting Egyptian children, the Pharaoh's child included. And the death of the firstborn is the final plague. And after this, Pharaoh finally says, "Get out of my place, get out of my country. I don't want you anywhere near." And then eventually we see in a short time, he actually pursues them and chases them down. And you can read how God steps in and provides a miracle for that. So I hope you found this to be insightful, that what they worshipped, their whole system, their whole worldview was changed in a matter of 10 months. In the whole Egyptian pantheon, with its magic, its myths, its rituals, crumbled underneath the feet of God. And he did that as a demonstration to bring judgment upon the Egyptians and their gods and their deities, and to show the world and all future generations that Yahweh stands by himself as the most powerful. And Exodus is a great reminder of that. And God rescues those people and takes them to a mountain where he gives them the 10 Commandments, and that's where we're heading. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you guys later.